Welcome everyone. My name is Rachna. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the University of Melbourne Graduate Student Association. So post our International Women's Day webinar for telecast yesterday, happy International Women's Day, because we agreed that it was just going to be the beginning of having many more International Women's Day celebrations moving forward, and we don't have to wait for one full year to have the celebration. So again, a warm International Women's Day, happy International Women's Day, to celebrate all the achievements of every woman who's on this planet. So welcome to everyone, and thank you for all the participants who've taken the trouble to register. And may I just request that if those participants, just to support with the sound system, if you can mute yourself, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions from our panel members. So I am extremely delighted to have with me my colleagues and friends and staff and stakeholders, partners who continue on this crusade with us at GSA and the entire community, to have a discussion on safety on placement for students at the workplace or internship. So before I commence and before I introduce everyone on the panel, I'd like to acknowledge the place that I'm broadcasting from. It's the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to also pay my respect to all the people of the lands from where y'all are, located, either in an office or wherever you are. And also probably it's a good time to acknowledge that in the current world, we do have people from who are overseas, and I just want to pay my respects to those respective communities there. I wish to formally recognize the elders, families, and forebearers of the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge they are the traditional custodians of the land and have been so for a millennia. We acknowledge that the land that we're meeting is a stolen land, and that the Wurundjeri people have never ceded their sovereignty on these lands and treaties and yet to be recognized. So we additionally acknowledge the First Nations people's living culture, knowledge, and the struggle in this region. And we pledge our ongoing solidarity with the traditional owners and all the owners and all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people in their struggle for the recognition of sovereignty, the historical truths, and justice. It would be just appropriate on this particular day also to acknowledge some of the struggles of the women who haven't been able to, who are not with us anymore in the struggle of violence in our community, and also celebrate those people who have challenged the systems and the survivors of violence in our community. So I think keeping that in mind, I am so delighted. I have 4 people whom I've been very, very fortunate over the last period of my career at GSA to have these ongoing conversations, be absolutely inspired by their dedication and commitment to this work. So I'd like to take this opportunity and privilege to actually introduce Scarlette, who has been absolutely passionate and actively volunteers with feminist organizations across Australia. So when she's not programming shorts with the Melbourne Women in Film Festival, which sounds so interesting in summer, she's coordinating engagement and outreach projects for the One Woman project. And in 2019, people like Scarlette, who are absolutely inspirational, co-founded the Womendeavour at the University of Melbourne to help students with marginalized identities transition from university to work. And she now serves on the Womendeavour's advisory board, so to make time for research as a PhD student at ANU and for teaching cultural studies at the Uni Melb. So Scarlette, a warm welcome to you, and we really look forward to having this conversation. And I have with me Dr. Patrick Tidmarsh, and many of you who are already at the University of Melbourne and UMSU are very, very familiar with Patrick's work and his passion for this area. So Patrick has worked in the field of sexual crime for over 30 years in a variety of roles, and he's currently the Sexual Harm Response Coordinator at UMSU. And he has worked with adult sex offenders in both custodial and community setting, and began Australia's first program for adolescents committing sexual offences, the Male Adolescent Program for Positive Sexuality. For the last 12 years, he's worked for the Victoria Police, creating new methodologies for investigating sexual crime and training specialist sexual crime investigator. He's worked with so many projects, and including the Respect and Responsibility training for the AFL clubs and the inaugural Therapeutic Treatment Board for youth displaying sexualized behaviors. So welcome, Patrick. And Patrick's been a great contributor for the Safety on Placement project. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine Alligan. And I think, first of all, I'd like to introduce her as our GSA Women's Officer, who has been absolutely vocal, passionate about GSA continuing our crusade, always in collaboration with our partners. And that's one thing that she remains, that we're just not going to be the ones running away, but actually taking people along. And she is a junior doctor emerging leader at STEM. Her work focuses on reproductive health for children and adolescents with cancer. Kate is recognized as a transitional scientist in the field, resulting from having authored a number of peer-reviewed papers, and has a higher research degree, which she's currently undertaking, and honors and research students. She supervises at the Royal Women's Hospital. She's also the women's representative at the Council of the Australian Postgraduate Association, and she is, that's formerly known as, known more popularly as CAPA. And she's working with the Australian university sector to implement programs to raise awareness and eliminate sexual violence, including harassment and sexual assault across the sector. I can go on with a whole lot of awards that she has won, and we'll definitely be putting up her bio on our website. But I think she's got a doctorate, apart from having a doctorate in medicine and a bachelorate of science. She's one person whom I've met who always has multiple degrees going on at one time. So it's amazing how she continues her academic pursuit, but absolutely committed to the cause, and delighted to have her championing this issue at GSA. Of course, I am absolutely privileged to work with my colleague, Dr. Natasha Abraham, who is our Senior Policy Coordinator at GSA. And I've had the privilege of working with her over the last 13 months. She has been the president at CAPA for 2 consecutive years. But apart from being a PhD holder, she has, from Monash University, she currently heads the Safety Placement Project at GSA, and been absolutely dedicated to ensure GSA are supporting our graduate representatives in this issue. It's taken me a while to kind of introduce all of you, but I think it is so apt because it's a day to celebrate our achievements. It's a day to kind of thank you for your ongoing contributions. So really today, what we want to talk about is issues of safety, issues of safety for students who are on placement and at workplaces. I just probably wanted to acknowledge that these conversations are quite hard, and they're difficult, they're painful, they do bring memories of incidences that were not pleasant. But, and so our staff have put up some information on our chat program of agencies that you may, all the panelists or people who are participating, please ensure that you do contact the relevant agencies and seek support. And I highly recommend that on the chat or on Q&A, that you do not disclose any private information that is which is not appropriate for you to kind of share on a public platform. And I would highly recommend that you take legal support from UMSU as well as the relevant community organizations that have been promoted on our website or on this discussion. So we had a couple of questions for our panelists. It'll be a great time to hear from some questions or comments from our attendees too, but I may wait for the panelists to complete their comments and the presentation before I take questions from the attendees. So I may start off with you, Patrick, and I'll go in the order of Patrick, Scarlette, and Catherine in that order, and maybe reverse a little bit in between. But Patrick, you've worked in the sector for a long period of time, and we always keep saying this year after year, lots needs to be done to address gender equity at the workplace. And, I think I entered the sector of community sector as a very young woman, and I feel year after year as I've gained a few summers and winters, I always think, why should women have to still struggle to ensure their rights are protected even today? And what are your thoughts about why does this struggle continue?
Thank you. So I've spent, sorry, I've just got pop-ups. I've spent my whole time working with offenders and in prevention work with men and in investigating. And so I suppose for that reason, and also because my role is around sexual harm specifically here at the uni, I want to concentrate on that and why within your question is, why is there still inequity and what impact's that having on the way we're still responding to sexual harm. And I suppose doing it in this week after the last couple of weeks that we had is particularly telling, because if you look at the Brittany Higgins case, for example, what immediately gets trotted out? First of all, our Prime Minister can only respond as a father, he can't respond as a man. And I think that is hugely telling as to how most men still understand this matter. And within a very short space of time, the conversation was, well, it's a he said, she said matter. There was conversation about her drinking. There was conversation about her delay in complaint. So, and then of course that shut up when a second and a third and then a fourth woman came forward about that. But it shouldn't have taken three other people to do that. So I think what that tells us is shame and blame is still in the wrong place. And there is a lack of knowledge about how offending happens. I want to come to that in a sec, but I think first and foremost, we analyze the behavior of victims, we challenge them, we doubt them, and the questions are always about them rather than the offenders themselves. And even in the Porter case, we heard he said, she said. We looked at. I was listening to a news report last night, and the emphasis of the reporter was on this complaint is 33 years old, and he said it like it was incredibly significant. Well, historical sexual crime can be investigated just like anything else. So why are we still saying that as if that's a problem? And then, of course, there were comments about her mental health and how that made her somehow untrustworthy, not the fact that clearly her mental health has suffered because of what happened to her. So I think my first answer is shame and blame is in the wrong place. And I was reading through some material in trying to think about talking today. And so the first two that came to mind was an article by Clementine Ford that said, the reason we still have inequity is because men don't care about women's lives. Now you can trust Clementine Ford for a provocative comment, but I think there's a lot to that. The next thing is Judith Herman said back in one of the follow-up copy of Trauma and Recovery, which is such a great book on this subject, only in 2005, she said that the reason we don't care that there's been no change in sexual crime is because the public are ambivalent at best, and that victims don't come forward because there's no community support. Now, I'm not sure that's true to the same extent it was in 2005, but I think it's by and large still true that 40% of people in Australia, for example, still believe that women lie a lot about sexual crime. And make up stories. So that's a huge challenge. And then I was also reading a comment by Rachel Bergen, who's a Melbourne academic, who said that in terms of reporting and justice, the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as it was intended to work. And the problem is it's out of touch with reality.
Yeah.
So the next bit, I think I've constantly been surprised about how little people know and how many myths and misconceptions there are about crime, sexual harms and crimes. So people are reporting into a culture and an atmosphere knowing they're unlikely to be understood by a significant group of people. And so shame and blame and then judgment, our judgment is in the wrong place. We don't focus on him, we focus on her. And look, I say him and her because 80% of victims are female, but 20% are still male. I'm not ignoring those, and I'm sure later on we'll come to intersectionality and why, you know, inequity breeds vulnerability in other places too. But by and large, this is men doing things to women. And the last thing I wanted to say, because I know you want us to be brief, is that gender equity is really just the beginning. And for example, in a country like Finland, which has done remarkable things to improve gender equity and has, I think, the youngest female prime minister in history there, they still have archaic laws around sexual crime. So their construct of rape isn't based around consent, it's still based around threat and violence and fear, rather than being consent-based. So the structures of more equitable societies are a part of it, but there are other elements in people's attitudes and knowledge and beliefs that we're also going to need to talk about to build on a more equitable culture.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I will probably ask Scarlette briefly, in your, you know, as a person who co-founded the Womendeavour group, and hearing what Patrick had to say, could you briefly just comment on why do you feel, you know, as a woman, that you just have to keep hammering about this topic all the time?
Yeah, I loved Patrick's points. And after speaking to one of our strategy team members, she raised a point very similar to a quote that Patrick mentioned, which is the system is working as it meant to be, right? So we are still struggling today because, you know, our corporate world, our professional workplaces, you know, are built without gender equity in mind. So gender equity and the struggles for equity between races, ethnicities, and all of that are slapped onto a very patriarchal and capitalist system, like a Band-Aid or quick fix, or like, you know, you have Google Chrome and it's an extension rather than the foundation of these workplaces. And I think as young women, young feminists, we're in a very interesting historical place where we must navigate not just the very complicated rhetoric of feminism. We also have to deal with like a very neoliberal, individualistic space in time where, you know, is our feminism for us to succeed, or is our feminism for everybody else as well? We have to, you know, in order to succeed, in order to be successful in our workplaces, we have to sustain some of that culture, some of that environment. And I think a case in point, relating this back to the Brittany Higgins case, is the Minister of Defense, Linda Reynolds, how she's been responding to that case and the lack of support she's given to Ms. Higgins. I think it's very telling of how we as women have to interrogate our places in this system as well. It's not enough that we think of how men are responding to the culture and the environment that they've sustained. Is also how we as women are helping sustaining that system, sustaining that workplace culture where it's difficult for other women and marginalized identities to speak up and tell us that they've been unsafe. Yeah, I think that's my answer. And
thank you so much. No, I think it sets really a continuity and get a perspective from your end. And I may get Kate to kind of respond to this, you know, from your perspective.
So I think that we still struggle because sexual assault and harassment is still so prevalent if you look at what's been happening, especially recently in the media, it takes stories to change, and it takes a lot of bravery to come and speak. When you do speak, what happens to your career? So it's really hard to report. I think this is a scary time to be a woman or somebody who is gender diverse, when all we see at the moment is sexual assault and harassment, which is not responded to well. So the response has been poor. The outcomes for victims is not optimal. And at the end of the day, it's just still happening. It's pervasive and it's not appropriate. It doesn't need to happen.
Thank you, Kate. And I mean, I guess from my perspective, when I summarize from it is we are questioning what we believe in, to some extent, the message yesterday somebody said, we consider normal, you know, have we started accepting, normalizing the way women are treated, or the messaging we are given by leaders as, oh, this is all we can happen. Pretty much the first officer of the country is talking about the legal framework rather than being able to ensure when there's a progressive group of thinkers about saying it's not about the proof, it is about the experience, and let's call it for what it is. And when I hear words like women are still worried, or, you know, this is happening, it is something that it can't just go by the by, because we're in a university environment. And what shocked me probably a little bit over the last 18 months is even our own processes for students who are preparing themselves for the workplace of what they accept as normalcy, let's say. So I may start off when you, Kate, probably from you, you know, when you think about, if you were to, it's very hard to list, you know, it's very hard to say it's this issue, that issue, that issue that women experience. But, you know, in your mind, what are the three major issues for safety when women when they are experienced, when they're talking about safety at the workplace? What are those issues really for them? And what is that when you speak to your colleagues, when you speak to people, particularly in your profession, where people may come and say, I'm not feeling really well because of these. If you were to kind of highlight and articulate on behalf of the people who do come and voice their concern, what do you think drives you for this advocacy?
So the question, so what are the three main
major issues? Yeah.
So I think definitely that reporting is not easy, and it's often not safe. So there aren't good structures in place if somebody is experiencing harassment or assault in the workplace. There are not good frameworks, and not all workplaces have this across the board. I think the Gender Equity Act that was done in 2020 with the gender equity reporting that's happening in 2021 will help to change some of those systems, but I think this is going to take a long time. Again, talking about sexual assault and harassment can be quite difficult, so we don't often have the dialogue to enable us to do this in safe spaces. And we're also not taught how to respond appropriately. And then as a bystander, we know that a lot of the people, or a lot of victims of sexual assault and harassment in the workplace, are also bystanders, and that this has a massive impact on them. So there aren't frameworks, or there aren't, what am I trying to say? There isn't systems in place that support bystanders to help them recover from the experience of sexual assault or harassment of a colleague as well. So I think generally they all focus around not being able to safely report, and then you have additional factors like not being able to access leave safely, not being able to access good maternity care without having your career sort of thrown into question, because we know that time off can then have a massive impact on our career, and where are the safe frameworks for that?
Thank you, Kate. And just for people who are attending the session, is that, you know, I do welcome comments, or if there are any questions that you want to put forward, which I can ask the panel members once we finish this session. But I think it's really, really important, Kate, that you talked about, let's look at the system, and how it's not about even user friendly. It's about, does it take into consideration the experiences, the trauma people go through? What's the role of the bystander who's witnessing this? And second one is sometimes the consequences of these complaints, that's a fear that people always have. I was listening yesterday with interest to some of the comments where people said, I experienced this extreme violence at the workplace, but I was so scared to say anything because I was afraid my career is going to be over, once I start this process. So Patrick, your comments on this issue, do you agree with Kate, or what's your observation on this, what are the three major issues for women, particularly when they've got to make, when they've got to address these concerns?
Well, I don't think I can, obviously, for obvious reasons, speak to women's experience of the workplace. So let's start there. Secondly, I totally agree with what Kate said about reporting, and the consequences and knock-on of reporting. But actually, when I was reading the question, my focus on it, I was thinking, well, how do offenders exploit that? And so the three main things that struck me, one is in the culture that you create. So inequity creates vulnerability, and offenders target vulnerability. So any inequity, whether it's gender-based, race-based, whatever that is, if it creates a vulnerability, and as we know, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but if you are a person of color, if you are Indigenous, young person, whatever group is outside the dominant norms, there's vulnerability there inherently. If it's in the workplace culture too, offenders will exploit that, because vulnerability allows them to isolate, to confuse, to control people. So that's number one. And I think when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about how long we've known that so, and reading studies back from the late 80s and early 90s that were creating cultures in research studies and putting men with high likelihood of harassing behavior and men of low likelihood of harassing behavior into cultures that either inhibited or promoted sexual harassment and other sexually abusive behaviors, and finding out very clearly that if you interestingly, if you allowed a culture that where harassment was tolerated, men with low likelihood did not take up that opportunity, and obviously men with high likelihood did. But if you created a culture that inhibited and had clear processes, and back to what Kate was saying, clear processes, protections for people that come forward, validated bystanders' experience, then men with high likelihood to abuse did so far less frequently. Now that's been clear in research studies for 30 years. Why is it not routinely a part of the way that we create workplace cultures? And the last one was thinking about, the individual pathology in those cultures and in those workplace situations. Offenders exploit vulnerability, and they, their tactics really. I suppose what I'm trying to say in this bit is we know a lot about how they're going to behave. And the more I talk to students, the more I realize that they might know the word grooming and they might know the word coercive control, but they don't connect it with their own experience as easily as I thought they would, So we've got a lot of young people out there, in particular in these institutions, who are experiencing a whole range of things and not knowing how to frame it and not seeing as him and what he's doing. And then, again, coming back to Kate's point, not knowing where to go, who to talk to, and what will happen should they come forward and talk about that. So one of the things that offenders do most commonly is work to make the person they are offending against feel responsible for what's taking place. And that is true across all sexual offending, whether it's against children, harassment, stalking, you name it, all those relationship harms. So I suppose it's back to what we're saying in the answer to the first one. It's if knowledge isn't there and shame and blame is in the wrong place, and people can't identify or connect their own experience with grooming or coercive control or offending, then they're less likely to come forward. And then when they do, we don't have the systems and structures in place to support them. And it's being writ large over the national newspapers and TV over the last couple of weeks.
We had a question here from an anonymous attendee about what's one advice you can give to men to enable a safe workplace. I think Patrick has articulated it quite well from highlighting what actually happens at the workplace that's there. But I also probably have to kind of bring in a personal thing about people in color when we talk about the workplace experience, and particularly for people who may come into the country as as a student or as an international student and haven't been worked in the legal sector, is what I have recognized is being an advocate for people like that is words like consent, what is rights, what is my ability to see through, is these are words that you haven't actually or grown up in an environment where it's easily understood. You're raised with certain values. You are foreign. When I say foreign, it's not your home, it's not your safety net at where you are in a foreign country. And we may have the simplest language, we may have mechanisms, we can have diagrams, but that emotion that you experience and that true feeling of sadness is often a burden that prevents you from taking that first step. And I think it is so real for a victim who has experienced that, because I have heard people whom I've worked with, clients who have said is, my parents would be so ashamed if if anything came out in the public or to my community. And it is extremely a difficult challenge, particularly for a person of color who may have migrated or who may have a different experience at home. And I think it's a good point that you've raised, Patrick. I may talk to Scarlette, your views and thoughts on this question.
Yeah, Rachna, I totally see where you came from with that comment on, as a working class, first generation Vietnamese immigrant to Australia as well, there's a lot of pressure to maintain your parents' Australian dream, right? To fit in and to be successful, and to do almost anything to get that, well-paying job. And coming from that, culturally different perspective, but also speaking to the Australian context as well, I think it's one thing to have frameworks and have the language to articulate, your feelings of unsafety, but it's another to grow up in a society where, when you set your boundaries, you are punished for it, or, you have someone in a very powerful position saying that you're threatening the rule of law by setting boundaries or by kind of like naming, offenses to your well-being. And I think, unfortunately, women and people with marginalized identities have been socially conditioned to compromise their boundary at every turn as we work, especially as young women, and young students who your first encounter with the professional workplace is through your part-time job in the hospitality or retail sector, through unpaid internship, through very poorly paid graduate programs, where your performance at these jobs depend on invisible labor on top of the actual labor that you perform at that job. So what by invisible labor, I mean emotional labor and aesthetic labor as well. So you need to come across as friendly, as accommodating as possible, but at the same time, you need to look very nice, very kind of like conventionally attractive as well, to be deemed friendly, extroverted, and good at your job. And from that very get-go, we're conditioned to negotiate our authentic inner psyche mentality in order to be successful at our jobs. And from that very get-go, our boundaries, our ability to articulate and put our foot down and say, no, I'm not going to do this for the job, has been in a way already. So, you know, when we apply that and we kind of like, you know, extrapolate that to our actual jobs and careers in the workplaces, you know, what's left, you know, how can we, you know, actually define our boundaries and articulate no, or say no to tasks or say no to these requests when we don't really have a good sense or good understanding of where our boundaries is. And to add on to that, you know, being able to say no is one thing. We also have to deal with a system that, you know, increasingly making it harder for us to say no as well. And with this in mind, I'm thinking of, you know, the changes to job seeker qualification, where a hotline has been established to employers to report when someone is declining a job offer and they might be on job seeker, right? So Catherine mentioned, you know, there's a lack of framework for us to report, but there's also, you know, the provision of frameworks for employers to further exploit and take advantage of inequities and of our vulnerability. So, you know, it makes young students, young women more vulnerable than before, and having to say yes to compromise our boundaries yet again in order to not be reported, in order to have an income. So yeah, so I guess my answer ultimately is that we live in a society where saying no is punishable. Yeah, and you know, boundaries is really negotiable, and we don't really have that power to, you know, define where our boundaries are.
Thank you, Scarlette. I may just read the next a question that has been put forward by an anonymous attendee or a comment before we go on to just getting a final comment from all of you about a collaborative approach to address changes in our workplace culture. It says, is the criminal justice system fundamentally incapable of supporting victims of the Sashi by nature, that we need to look more to other mechanisms of supporting victims, or are the deeply entrenched flaws in the system more just a reflection of our society's current and long-standing views towards women and other marginalized systems? Joe, I think that to summarize that long question, it's really about you know, re-emphasizing what Patrick, Catherine, and Scarlette said is, yes, we have a system. We know some behavioral, you know, particularly with perpetrators, the behavior and the exploitation points that Patrick talked about, the vulnerability and the way it's exploited. So Patrick, I think you're probably the best person to talk about this question, is if you want to respond to that question briefly, and then we may just go on to a brief comment about why we agree it's a collaborative approach to address this kind of workplace culture. So over to you, Patrick.
Okay, thank you. I want to say something positive and optimistic, which is, I think in the last 10, maybe even longer, 20 years, a lot has changed in the broader criminal justice system's response. So we've come a long way, changing laws, judicial directions, protecting children, Royal Commission. We've got multidisciplinary centres now where people who work with victims sit alongside investigators. We have family violence investigators sitting in those same units because we've understood there are connections there. We've become more victim-centric. We have, in policing, there's more specialisms. We've improved interviewing of children. There's a vast number of things that, that have actually got better. And made it easier for people to come forward and tell their story. And reporting rates, you know, I mean, yes, the reportable conduct's changed. We've got Me Too. Reporting rates have changed for a variety of reasons, but they've increased significantly. But part of that is that the system's got better. What hasn't changed is attrition has not shifted. So we still lose cases through investigation that don't get through to the courts. And conviction rates around the developed world, worse in some countries than others. The UK, for example, absolutely plummeted. Conviction rates are, so the second part of the question is deeply depressing. Is adversarial justice the best way to deal with this? No. Putting people into the middle of a fight in order to hear this story? No. So my answer to the main part of the question would be, are there other alternatives that we should be exploring that are better for people, that are better for the individuals involved, for bystanders, for the community? Yes. We should be looking at restorative practices. We should be looking at other forms of therapeutic systems that are better for people. And we should be looking at community responses as well as responses between individuals. I think it doesn't matter how much you improve adversarial justice at that level, it's never going to be effective in understanding relationship-based crime. But remember, a lot has changed and a lot has got better. So maybe when those two answers join up and we've got better systems and better processes, then all the improvements that we've made will show more fruit than they have to date.
Thank you, Patrick. I may get Scarlette to kind of talk about, we all know that, we all agree it's a collective responsibility. And I guess I am of a generation that I have to agree with Patrick that, I don't definitely feel, I don't feel the despair as I would feel as the 21-year-old who had to kind of do waitressing, where it was okay to be said and people do anything to you, but you still continue to kind of keep working because that's what you're there for. So I don't feel that despair, and I think a lot has been done, but I still want to go back to about one very interesting aspect that I was talking to about a parenting group, and they said the most important thing that they felt as a parent that they want to teach their children in particular was the respective behavior that's expected by each individual in the community. That the parents thought that it was great that they were going to teach the child how to study, to read, write, and everything that's there, but particularly being the parent of a male child, that their fundamental aim for the first formative years was actually talking about respected and expected behavior of that individual towards this community. And for me, that was so enriching, and that was really a very positive experience, as I want to join Patrick in that positivity kind of approach. But Scarlette, can you talk a little bit about where do you see that collaboration has to start from?
Collaborations. Supportive collaboration is a key value within Womendeavour as an organisation. So when we recruit volunteers, we always ask them, what do you think about teamwork? What helps you work well in a team? But we also acknowledge that collaboration goes beyond teamwork as well, because collaboration to us also means allyship, to stand in solidarity with other marginalized identities and to actively listening to them, to hear about their experiences, what they've been through, and how we could help as an ally without risking their voices, without deplatforming them. So as I mentioned before, I think we're in a very interesting place historically as feminist advocates, because we have fought and gained considerable equality to men and considerable changes to the criminal justice system. New frameworks are being made and enforced, but we also have to stop and reflect and ask whether this equality is enough, or can we further investigate this framework and see whether further changes could be made so that it's not just women's equality to men, but also racial equality, considerations of accessibility for people with different abilities, sexuality, and gender freedom as well. And this is where intersectional feminism is the very core tenet of collaboration and support. Without understanding how these different identities and marginalization resulting from different identities compound upon each other, we can't make this collaboration meaningful because it'll be always at the surface level. So we, as a group, we really support collaboration, and we always try our best to make sure that all the voices are heard. But we also acknowledge at the same time that, we can only go so far as a group. We can only, as a youth-led, student-run group, we can't do everything. We definitely do not have the expertise that Catherine, Natasha, or Patrick have to deal with these reports of sexual harassment or sexual assault. So this is where collaboration beyond Womendeavour come in. We need to collaborate with different organizations and agencies to make sure that when someone reports something, they are actually heard, that something could be done, real results could be produced so that they get the resolution that they need as someone who survived that incident. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And just as a plug-in is Megan's put in all the details of Womendeavour and particularly the membership. And I encourage, it is a plug-in for the group. So please do ensure that you've got the details. And Catherine, that flows in really well for you to talk about the Safety on Placement project. It would be great if you wanted to include your comment and do the presentation of your project, and then move on to Natasha, who can tell us how we can participate in the survey. So I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. So did you want me to share some slides?
Yes. Are you? Yeah, please do.
I can do that. Just give me 1 second, please.
And while that's being done, please, the people on the attendees, if there are any comments, and please feel free to put that on the chat.
Is this working?
Yes, very well.
So, oops, I'm going backwards. So this presentation has been made by Natasha, as well as some slides that I've added in. I think that when we look at what drives change, we know that reporting of data drives change, reporting of sexual assault and harassment drives change, and also, according to Kate Jenkins, the Sex Commissioner or Sex Discrimination Commissioner, workplaces and independent bodies need to know where they stand in the pack, as well as countries and governments. So we've seen Australia fall in terms of its gender equality ratings in the last few years. So we know that to improve practice, we need to make sure that we collect data, that we report data clearly, and that we have access to everything that we need to in terms of frameworks and support for people who do report. So this is just a little bit about the Respect at Work report that the Commission released in 2020, as well as some things that I've come across reading. The Respect Now Always report from 2017 is the report that is, I guess, the foundation of some of the work that the university is doing to ensure that students can learn and engage in community life in safety, and that they have all the requirements that they need if they are to experience harassment or assault. So I think it's good to know that sexual harassment in Australia is actually it's a legal position. However, despite sexual harassment being part of an act and a legal thing, harassment continues in the workplace. Sexual assault, also, I won't go through this, but it's there if anyone needs it. So understanding what defines or classifies as sexual harassment and assault is really important, both for those who experience it, for bystanders, and for the perpetrators of it. If we don't understand what it is, then how can we stop our behaviours? I didn't get that. Sorry, my watch is talking to us. So Australia has a really good history of tackling assault and sexual harassment. So we saw in the 1970s that women's organisations in Australia really began to push for legal and social recognition. We had the International Labour Organization Discrimination Convention that was enacted in 1973, and the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which the governments put into act in 1983. So these states began to enact anti-discrimination laws, which have then pushed for the elimination of workplace sexual harassment. This continues to be a key priority for all the bodies, and especially the Australian Human Rights Commission, but we note that Australia lags behind other countries in both the prevention and responding to sexual harassment in the workplace. So the three key reports that really, I think, give us some good information and have also sort of set the ground for the project that GSA is running. They are the Change the Story report, which is a framework for the primary prevention of violence against women and their children. We have the Change the Course report, the National Report on Sexual Assault and Harassment at Australian Universities, and the most recent Respect at Work report, which is the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces. So there are some key findings from the report. Firstly, this was the first national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. It occurred over 4 periodic surveys, and it looks at the national experience of harassment. In 2018, these surveys showed that sexual harassment is pervasive and it's widespread. That in the last 5 years, or people who have been in the workplace in the last 5 years, 1/3 of those, or 33%, have experienced sexual harassment. We also know that women are more likely to experience sexual harassment than men. There are workplaces where people are at higher risk of experiencing sexual harassment, and those include media, telecommunications industry, the arts and recreation industry. We know that these workplaces are often male dominated because they have a male skewed gender ratio or an overrepresentation of men in senior leadership roles. The nature of the work that's being done is considered not traditional, so we have gender biases, and there can also be this sort of hyper-masculine workplace culture. These workplaces can also involve a high level of contact with third parties, so patients, customers, clients, and they're organised according to a hierarchical structure. So if you think about it at university or in the medical profession, we have a very set hierarchical structure, which can make it difficult, especially when you have someone from the top harassing someone, I guess, at the bottom. We know from the report that each victim's experience is unique and it can be influenced by a range of factors, but the two most reported types of behaviours were sexually suggestive comments or jokes or intrusive questions about private life or physical appearance. The report noted that harassment often escalated, and the Commission heard that several victims of sexual harassment began as verbal exchanges and then ended up as rape or sexual assault, which is just devastating. There are identified drivers of sexual harassment at the workplace, and these are around gender disparity and gender inequality. So while gender inequality is an underlying condition for sexual harassment, it's not the only factor that drives it. We also need to understand that there is an intersectionality between or for sexual harassment, and that those people who are more likely to experience sexual harassment are not only women, but people who are gender diverse, people with a disability, and people who are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Other things that drive sexual harassment in the workplace are similar to those that drive sexual assault and harassment at universities, and that includes the use of alcohol in work context and actually not understanding what constitutes sexual harassment. So the take-home points from me reading this report, and I preface this by saying I am not an expert in this area, but they are that sexual harassment is not just a women's issue, that it's a societal issue in which every person, every workplace, and every institutional education can contribute to addressing, and that we know that sexual harassment and assault are not inevitable, they are not acceptable, and they are preventable. So this leads us to the Safety on Placement project, which is supported by core funding of GSA and is being driven by Natasha. So through the background, through being a part of the Respect Task Force and conversations with UMSU, GSA has had growing concerns that many students who undertake placements or internships are unaware of reporting channels for sexual assault and harassment. We've identified some issues, and this is that students are not aware of where to report incidents and possible outcomes, that information is not available in languages other than English, and that some students, including international students, may not understand what constitutes unacceptable workplace behaviour. Further work is required to understand the safety on placement, identify issues, and discover opportunities for improvement. So this is especially relevant for graduate students where they have courses where there is a requirement to undertake a placement, and also for higher degree research students. The aims of this project will consult with students on university placement and internship issues with a focus on preventing sexual assault, harassment and workplace misconduct. As an action research project, it aims to provide recommendations to the University of Melbourne on best practice to prevent sexual assault and also of handling on reports when an incident does occur on placement or on internship. It's using the framework of a literature review with some desktop research. There'll be 2 surveys, also some workshops and stakeholder engagement. Hopefully the results of this project will be used to advocate to the university on implementing better practices, basically making placements and internships safer, for developing informational resources for grad students who are going out on placements or internships, and to promote awareness of safety issues relating to any student placements or internships. So I think Natasha has a slide as well and some information to share with you.
Let me just take a little pause so that I know it was, thank you so much, Kate. It was a very comprehensive presentation. But I guess that the most important thing is for people who are attending is all this information will be made available on the website. And, you know, it is quite a lot to take at the moment. But I think to understand, just leading on from a collaborative approach, that we do fund it from our core funding, but it's not because we believe that we're the champions of the issue. I just say it's just a project that we have used the shared knowledge and understanding of our partners, and we don't believe an individual or anybody can be an expert in this, because each one's experience and understanding of what they experience, we just want to validate that, because often I think people have told us that, you know, it is so diverse and different, and the importance is that GSA is just a catalyst to keep the conversation going. And I do re-emphasize that people who do have individual you know, support required, that it is important that you access the legal service that's provided by UMSU and the other relevant services, and for Center for Sexual Assault and Safer Communities that's established by the university. This project just facilitates the dialogue and the discussion to support the understanding that experiences for our students are real, and it's not something that can be forgotten and kept as a report on our shelf. It just requires each generation to continue chipping away, so that, as Patrick said, things have improved and it needs to still keep improving. So over to you, Natasha, to give us a bit of an overview about how best you're seeking support from our students in participating in this project.
Thank you very much. I'll just go ahead and share my screen so I can share a bit of information with everyone about the Safety on Placement project, building on what Kate has just presented to us. So before I do present that information, I just want to make sure that everyone has the information for support services. We have listed a couple here, both university and external services that you can access. And Tavita will also post this information in the chat, so you can access it there. If you do want to get in contact with someone, but you're struggling to sort of navigate the services or you can't get in touch, feel free to give us a call at GSA on our 1-800 line as well, and we'll be able to point you in the right direction. So we are launching our Safety on Placement survey. So as Kate mentioned, there's a number of different components to the Safety on Placement project, including 2 surveys. So today we're just launching the first of those surveys. So it's opening today. We are looking for survey participants who will be who are studying a coursework degree that contains at least 1 placement and have at least 1 year left in your course, with at least 1 placement planned in that period. So the idea is we survey you now before you've gone on one of your placements, and then we survey you again after you've had your placement. And the first 200 students who complete both surveys will receive a small voucher at the end of the project, and that's just in recognition, a very small recognition of the time and effort you spend participating in our project. So I've popped the link up there, and I'll put that in the chat in a second as well. So that is open from today, but please be aware it does discuss some themes which we might find difficult. And so for those of us who do decide to do the survey anyway, but might need some support, please do avail yourselves of those services listed in the previous slide. If you do want some further information about the project, including some of the information that Kate just presented, that is available on the GSA website under our campaigns, stances and issues section, or you can email our policy and advocacy team for further information. And I also just wanted to mention another really important unrelated survey that will be going on that we really want to encourage students to participate in, and that's the Respect Now Always survey. So Kate did talk about that just a couple minutes ago. So just to provide a little bit more information about that, it is the follow-up survey to that big 2017 survey that they did regarding sexual violence on campus or adjacent to campus. So it's the follow-up survey. It's going to be sent to students later this year. The University of Melbourne will be distributing that to students through your student emails. So please keep an eye out for that if that's something that you are interested in contributing to. And there is further information available, of course, on the Universities Australia website. And Kate would also be a really good contact if you do want to find out more about what's going on in that space. So that's the information I wanted to get across to you today. I'll pop the link in the chat, and thank you so much in advance for your participation in the Safety and Placement Survey, or even if you're not filling out the survey, your support of the project is very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. I think all this information will be made available on the website, and as I said, is please do access Center for Sexual Assault. We do have the respect number. We do have the, the CAP services that's listed down, as well as the Safer Communities information that's listed down on our chat, but it'll be available on our website. So just a final call from any of the attendees, if you had any specific questions to our members on the panel. But other than that, I'm just going to call on each one of you who's on our panels. First of all, thank you so much for the time that you spend participating in all our webinars. And I think, Patrick, we do always call on you, and you've been always very grateful to just jump on at any time. So if you want to just talk a little bit about your comments, and maybe even anything that you're currently working on at UMSU, which you think would be good information for our students to hear. Just a final comment from you, Patrick, and then I'll go to Scarlette and Catherine.
Thanks, Rachna. I appreciate it. Well, the last couple of things I wanted to say was about the collaboration question, really, which was, I mean, when people were talking, I was thinking, we can't even agree what collaboration is around sexual relationships and the way we see consent. You know, most countries in, don't have consent as a part of their legal framework. We don't have affirmative consent here in Victoria, so you still get the prioritization of assumed consent from him. We're so far behind, I think. Countries like Iceland and Sweden, for example, which have not just decided that consent is a collaborative process and needs to be treated differently in law. So they now have new offenses of, negligent sexual assault, negligent rape, in order to try and address the terrible conviction rates that they have. But I think even more importantly, have enshrined the changes they want to make in their education systems. So the systems of government are there to educate young people in particular about what that means. And in terms of the debate going on in Australia at the moment, I mean, we should look to those countries to see not just how brave and radical they've been, but how they have put it into their culture to try and change this at personal relationship and legal level anyway. So there was that, struck me as we were talking about collaboration. And the other thing I think that's really important in terms of safety on placement are the different cultures that we put students in. So not only is it hard for them to see within their own system, so we have different reporting at the university still, we don't have a standalone policies on sexual assault. So staff matters might be independently investigated, but student matters probably won't. So we've got a whole, we can't get our own house in order. But then when you put the students in placements in other cultures and other organizations that have, you know, different rules, if we don't match up across all those different organizations, how are students supposed to navigate that? It's just too complicated. And so what tends to happen is the whistleblower is moved on, the situation is put to one side, and that person, if they're lucky, will repeat their placement somewhere else, you know. So we have, for me, this is the most depressing part of this whole conversation. We have miles to go on this issue, and we leave people completely isolated in lots of ways. Having said that, I'm currently working on a couple of issues with different parts of the organization who are doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right way. And so, you know, when there is collective effort within University of Melbourne, but also with all the other agencies and institutions that we collaborate with, you can do good things and you can do them really quickly. The last thing I'll say in terms of what's happening, the students have put together their top 10 list of what they want from the university in terms of responding to sexual other relationship harms and prevention. So the first one is the standalone policies. The second is the development of a standalone health and wellbeing centre to remove all responses from the university away from the administration building. And so we've got movement on both those issues, but we will soon post the other 8, and I think I'm encouraged by how much focus there is on this issue, how many students are engaged on this issue, how good the politics are at the moment, how good we are at lobbying on this. So I think there's a lot of movement in the right direction, but there's an awfully long way to go.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Scarlette, your final comments?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on this panel today. I love the idea because I'm always in the position where feminism is not enough for me. We need to look at these things from the perspectives of women's rights, but also workers' rights as well. We need to look at how, you know, our society, a neoliberal, very individualistic society, you know, intersect with the capitalist workforce to further, you know, patriarchal systems and barriers. And you know, to celebrate International Women's Day, a celebration that originated from working women. You know, I think it can't be any more perfect than this to talk about safety in the workplace. And I also want to note that, you know, safety in a workplace does not just pertain to safety from physical harm. It's also safety from burnout and marginalization and isolation as well. As a woman of color who was new to Australia, who's from a working class family, when I founded Womendeavour, I felt very isolated. I didn't know where to go with my career, what steps to take into academia. So Womendeavour emerged from that need to find community, to lessen that sense of marginalization and isolation. And following the impact of COVID-19, I understand that this marginalization intensified. And, you know, having a group of women and gender diverse people around you is quite restorative. So if you ever need a place to go, if you ever need to find a friend, consider Womendeavour, you know, not just as a place to find companionship, but also as a place to, you know, politically advocate for people just like you, to lobby for, you know, actions for policies, like Patrick said, to make sure that your voices are heard, because students' voices are powerful and they deserve to be heard. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Catherine?
Thanks for having me on this. This has been really great. I think, and it's been acknowledged already, but I would like to acknowledge that the last few weeks especially can be triggering or traumatizing for anyone who has experienced sexual assault or harassment. And I would encourage anyone who is having difficulty or just wants a chat to reach out. So 1-800-RESPECT, there are other services that will be put on. The things that I'm taking home from today are that we're not in a great situation, but I think there is hope, because we are working towards changing by seeing people share their lived experience, and by being brave and speaking out. We are starting a discussion. We have national discourse, which has been challenging and scary, but also good because it's now on the table. It's on our front pages of our newspapers. We're talking about it around the dinner table, and we're realizing that it's not just an issue about a woman who has been assaulted. It is about that we aren't safe as a collective, that our younger people aren't safe, and that workplaces and schools and education facilities, just generally being alive, we need to be safe so we can be healthy and fulfill everything that we need to do, and to continue to contribute. So I think while it's not all good news at the moment, I do leave hopeful that we can change things and make things better. And I would like to say a huge thank you to everyone who contributes to all the fantastic work that's being done. So
thank you, Catherine. So first of all, a big thank you to the panel members, Patrick, Scarlette, and Catherine, for your valuable time that you put into today's discussion. I'd really like to thank all the attendees and our students who will be listening to this webinar over the next few days, because the important message for me as a person who feels quite privileged to have worked in this area all through my career, in Australia, is that I think this is one area of work where it's not about being a leader. It's not about who's on the top. It's not about branding a finding. It's actually making a difference. And whatever that difference is, whether it's small, whether it's big, whether you are a part of the system to make you safe or an individual safe, it all makes a difference. And I still go back to that messaging that we want to give in our community right from the infancy stage to the life of our being, that respecting people and your behavior has consequences on others, whether you're the CEO or whether you are a volunteer, irrespective of where you are within a home or your environment. That's a responsibility that we need to be aware of. So thank you so much for your time. And I would not be doing justice if I don't thank all the council members of GSA who provide a lot of support and guidance to the student movement. So a big thank you to GSA Council, but I also want to acknowledge the work of UMSU, and particularly the student representatives in the UMSU group who are so proactive, vocal, tenacious. So thank you so much, and particularly a big thank to the organizations at the university who collaborate with us on these issues. And of course, my team, absolutely privileged for the policy and advocacy team and the work undertaken by Natasha, but all the other members, Sean, Cara, past members, staff members, Jonathan, Ali, Vibol, and Michael. And all this is never possible unless the student engagement team, day after day, they just continue. And, it's headed by Tavita, but people like Jill, Andrew Lee, Mani, the Chelsea, Suba, and all the other staff members who make this possible. We're a small team, and it's so easy to remember all your names, but I do, sometimes say that if I haven't not mentioned your name because you're the most important person in my life, and that's what I give myself, I wouldn't give it to my memory. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. And this project belongs to us. It is not GSA, it's not, it actually belongs to us as a community, and let's just put our best foot forward. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to your participation.